How's it going? My name is Lean Green. I decided to create the Crash and Course YouTube channel in direct competition with Crash Course because I had to do a project. That's why we're here. Okay, but what are we gonna talk about today? And if we go to the next slide, boom. We're talking about the principles of research methods in AP Psychology, pages 41 through 53. So let's just get started. Let's just jump right into it. First of all, how do psychologists conduct research is what we're basically gonna be covering here today. Well, when it comes to conducting research in the field of psychology, psychological scientists use 3 research methods.
Now, these research methods include the descriptive methods, correlational methods, and experimental methods.
What we're going to be doing today is we're going to describe the common research methods used in psychological science. And we're also going to use real-world examples. We're going to start off with the first method, which I listed over here. It is the descriptive methods, all right? Now, the descriptive methods are a set of research methods designed for making careful, systematic observations in psychology. 3 of these methods include case studies, naturalistic observations, and surveys. Incredible. Now moving on to case studies. Case studies are, an in-depth analysis of the behavior of one person or a small number of people. Now I'm going to give an example of this. We have that guy, his name is Phineas Gage.
Now, this young man was nailed right in the brains with a metal pipe. Psychologists then studied him in a sort of case study, if you will. In this case study, they analyzed this specific individual thoroughly in order to figure out how this brain injury affected his sudden change in personality and behavior.
So remember, case studies are when they study one weird guy or a few weird guys. Remember that. Next, we have naturalistic observations. Now, naturalistic observations are an in-depth study of a phenomenon in its natural setting. And for another example, we have Jane Goodall's research on chimps.
Jane closely observed chimps in their natural environment for many years without directly interfering with. Doing so, she noted how the chimps used the tools and did society and such.
So also remember this. Naturalistic observations is like when they look at monkeys in the forest and such, kind of. And finally, we have surveys, which are sort of like questionnaires that allow us to ask large numbers of people questions about attitudes or behavior. And for another example of what a survey is, the third descriptive method, we have an example from Lean Green's social media post. I'm talking first person now. So basically,
and while we were arguing, I decided to make a social media survey in order to figure out if my friend abuses dogs. It's right here. Let's see.
oh yeah, so basically, remember that surveys is when your friend abuses their dog and you make an Instagram poll to get the populace to weigh in on things. Kind of, not really. Moving on. We're moving on from descriptive methods. We're now on a second method in which psychologists do research. Now I want you to remember this word and its definition. This word is the word correlation, which is a measure of the direction and strength of the relationship between 2 variables or factors that can change. Now this word is very important because correlations allow us to predict behavior, stimulate development of hypotheses, and address some difficult ethical situations, such as video games and violence and such. It's very important. Now we're just running through the trials and tribulations of how correlation works, the correlational method.
Correlation is a measure of the strength of a relationship between 2 factors or variables that can change. So, and we're going to do a quick example. So for variable number 1, we have the rank in which you receive after experiencing a setup review from Ian Go, the famous streamer, alright? And variable number 2 is the amount of joy that you have in your life. Now that we know our 2 variables, we have to begin an analysis of our correlations by measuring these variables and then comparing the values of one variable to those of the other. This is worded weird. So basically it's saying that we take the value of one variable. So we're going to talk about variable number 1, which is the rank Ian Go gives you your setup. So on a scale of 1 to 10, let's say Ian Go give me a 10, which is on the level of omnipotency. Next, we take variable number 2 and we measure its value, so the amount of joy that I have in my life. Now I'd have to say that I'm so happy, I'll give myself probably like an 8. And then after we measure the values of each variable, we must next compare and analyze the results, which leave us with
3 possible outcomes in the relationship between the 2 variables.
So the relationship between variable number 1, which is the rating Ian Go gave my setup, has a positive correlation with variable number 2, which is the amount of joy I have in my life. And that would mean that if Ian Go gave me a 10 out of 10 S tier on my setup, then my happiness would be at a 10 out of 10, which is equal to a positive correlation, because the higher Ian Go rates my setup has a correlational relationship to the amount of happiness I have in my life. And now, if the relationship between the 2 variables are negative, then that would mean the higher Ian Go gives my setup, the lower my happiness is overall. That would be a negative correlation. And if there's no correlation, then that would mean there would be no systematic relationship between any of the variables. Like, let's say we take a sample of 10 individuals who had their setup rated by Iengo. And let's say Iengo, he's going crazy. Like, he gives someone a 1 out of 10, and then he gives some other people some high setup reviews and whatever. It's just super mixed up. And if the happiness values of all of the individuals are also mixed up, then that would be no correlation. Whereas with a positive correlation, as Iengo gives each individual a higher setup review, then that would be correlated with a higher set of happiness between all the individuals.
And in correlation, we should also remember that there is a third variable, which is very, very important, okay, to know, to have in the brain of yours.
Now, the third variable in psychology is something extra that might be affecting the relationship between two things you're studying. It's like a hidden factor that can mess with your conclusions. For example, in the textbook, there was an example about how playing violent video games has a positive correlation with violence. But due to further research, the researchers' research proved that a third variable came into play, which was bullying. Because bullying makes kids want violence, and it's easier to do violence in video games, meaning that bullying makes kids want to do violence more. But kids usually don't go directly to shooting guns in real life. They instead might be choosing violent video games to let out the frustration of being bullied. It's pretty crazy stuff. Like right here, look, see that right there?
And finally, for our last method of research, we have the experimental methods. And as for what an experiment is a research method that tests hypotheses and allows researchers to make conclusions about causality. And by far, in the field of science and psychology, the experimental methods are the most powerful tool a scientist can use. Now, let's go and look at the components of an experiment.
These are very, very important. So, for the component number 1 that we must remember, that is the independent variable. The independent variable is a variable controlled and manipulated by the experimenter. And we're going to give some examples later on. I'm just going to lay this out real quick for your knowledge, okay? Next, for number 2, we have the dependent variable, which is a measure that demonstrates the effects of an independent variable. Number 3, control group, a group that experiences all the experimental procedures with the exception of exposure to the independent variable. For number 4, we have the experimental group, a group of participants who are exposed to the independent variable. And finally, number 5, we have the random assessment, which is the procedure in which each participant has an equal chance of being placed into any group in any experiment.
And to make it easier, to understand how each of these components work and such, here's an example experiment.
And this example experiment is meant to test if drinking water is associated with better memory for step 1 in the experiment. We must first gather a group of people to participate in our study, alright? Very easy, just go to the store and such, We must next randomly split them into 2 groups, one that drinks water, which is the experiment group, and one that doesn't drink water, which is the control group. We must then tell both groups that they will be doing a memory test. And while we do that, we do not mention that they will be drinking water and such, right? The experimental group drinks a glass of water, while the control group does not drink anything. Both groups then are given a list of 10 words to memorize. After that, we record how many words each participant remembers, and we compare the number of words recalled by each group to see if drinking water made a difference.
Now, this is just a little experiment that was laid out, and we're going to
analyze each of the components of this experiment so that we can have a better understanding of each of the components in an experiment.
So in this experiment, the independent variable, what was it? Go ahead and ask me. Come on, you could tell me. Raise your hand. So the independent variable was whether or not the participants drank water in the experiment. And for the dependent variable, we have how well the participants remembered each of the words. And the dependent variable is dependent on the independent variable, which was whether or not the participants drank water. Because we're trying to test if the participants' memory is affected by water. Yes, that's what we're doing here. That's why it's the dependent variable. Next, we have the experimental group. And I think I said it back here, but the experimental group drinks water before the memory test. And what do we say the control group was? It was a group that experiences all experimental procedures with the exception of exposure to the independent variable. So the control group, they have all the same things as the experimental group, except they aren't giving the independent variable, which is the water. I should just say the water is the independent variable, but whatever. And finally, we have random assessment. The groups were split by random, which means, to avoid bias, we randomly assigned participants to either the water group or no water group. Also, here's how the experiment looks like right here. You could go ahead to go to page 49 for that stuff. And finally, for our final section, it's a little bonus section for you and you only. We are assessing the effects of time. And there are 3 techniques psychologists use for assessing behavior associated with age. Wow. Time and age, they're pretty similar. We have cross-sectional study, longitudinal study, and mixed longitudinal design. And for cross-sectional study, it's basically just assessing age-related changes where data is obtained obtained simultaneously from all ages. For an example, we have a doctor asking about knee pain in a 10-year-old and from a 100-year-old. Next, we have the longitudinal study, where data is obtained from the same individual at intervals over a long period of time. Now, an example of this would be a doctor that asks about knee pain from little Timmy every year until he dies. And finally, for our final thing, we have the mixed longitudinal study, which combines both of the previous studies. It observes a sample of participants over a shorter period of time. So an example of this would be if a doctor asks kids aged 5 through 15 if they have knee pains until they grow old and die. And we're at the end of the presentation already. My name is Lean Green and I'm a goddamn machine. Be sure to complete your crash course worksheet and be sure to subscribe to crash course